It's all right now. Just let it all out.
What? What's going on?
Get her out of here before she contaminates the family name, the billionaire snapped, his voice slicing through the grand hall like a blade. Dozens of heads turned, champagne glasses frozen midair. He stood at the center, wrapped in a flawless designer suit, every strand of his hair combed into a performance of perfection. To him, life was a theater, and tonight's stage belonged to him. His father sat hunched in a leather armchair nearby, face buried in the maid's shoulder, tears wetting her simple cotton blouse. The billionaire's jaw clenched at the sight. To him, it wasn't grief being comforted, it was humiliation. A maid, of all people, cradling the man whose empire had built skyscrapers and fortune? Unthinkable, the guests murmured, shifting uneasily. Some chuckled nervously, others smirked, eager to see how far his cruelty would go. Phones rose discreetly, red recording lights glowing. This was the entertainment money bought. Arrogance dressed as confidence, humiliation disguised as power. The maid, a black woman with years of silent resilience carved into her posture, didn't flinch. She stood steady, her hand resting gently on the father's back, eyes calm, expression dignified. Her presence wasn't loud, yet it commanded the room. While the billionaire puffed himself larger with wealth, her silence made him look smaller. "Don't touch him again," he sneered, pointing like she was filth. "You're a maid. That's all you'll ever be. Don't mistake this for belonging." The words rippled through the room like poison. Some guests laughed outright, clinking glasses, relieved it wasn't them under his glare. Others looked away, embarrassed, though too spineless to intervene. The maid said nothing. Not a single muscle in her face moved. She had learned long ago that silence could cut deeper than any retort. His father's sobs grew louder, trembling under her steady hand. The billionaire snapped his fingers at the security guards lingering near the door. "Remove her, now." But the guards hesitated. Something in her stance, in her quiet defiance, made even men trained to obey hesitate. Her silence carried a weight that words could never hold. The billionaire scoffed, turning to the crowd, flashing his smile again, trying to regain control of the room. "This is what happens when we let servants forget their place," he announced, laughter forced, eyes darting to ensure the cameras were still rolling. "She thinks she matters." Nervous chuckles answered him, but unease lingered. Guests whispered into each other's ears, some glancing back at the maid with curiosity rather than disdain. There was something different about her, something unshaken by his cruelty. And then, the narrator's voice broke through like a low rumble before thunder. They thought it was harmless arrogance, a son defending status. But in moments, her silence would unravel a truth so devastating. His entire empire would tremble. She had grown up where the lights dimmed early. Not because of romance, but because electricity was expensive. Her childhood was a mosaic of hand-me-down clothes, half-empty cupboards, and long hours spent watching her mother scrub other people's floors. Hunger had been her first teacher, silence her second. Yet she carried both without bitterness. From the time she was 12, she had worked in households, dusting corners that no one noticed, polishing silverware that never graced her family's table. Some families treated her as invisible. Others made sure she knew her place with sharp words and sharper looks. But no matter how hard life tried to grind her down, she never let hardship strip away her dignity. She learned that true strength wasn't in shouting back, but in standing so tall that cruelty seemed small beside her. Her grandmother's voice lived in her bones. A mantra repeated in kitchens and on porches when the world seemed unbearable. Dignity doesn't shout, it waits. Then it roars. Those words stitched themselves into her spine, guiding her through every insult, every slammed door, every humiliation she endured. While others bowed or broke, she stood. Her dreams were not gilded. She didn't fantasize about penthouses, limousines, or power. Her dream was simple, to live with honor, to walk through the world knowing she had never compromised her integrity. But wisdom has a way of finding those who live with resilience. Through every quiet act of endurance, she gathered more insight than wealth could ever buy. The world mistook her silence for weakness, but her silence was a library of unspoken truths. On the other side of the spectrum lived the billionaire. His childhood was cushioned in silk sheets and chauffeured cars. Where she had studied shadows for comfort, he had studied mirrors for approval. Born into unimaginable wealth, he never questioned if doors would open for him. They always did. His family name was a master key. Privilege was not just given to him, it was engraved in his identity. From his earliest years, he had been taught that superiority was his birthright. His toys were imported, his playdates carefully curated with heirs and heiresses. He was raised not to build but to inherit, not to ask but to command. And in every gleaming reflection, he sought proof that he was above others. For him, appearances weren't decoration, they were survival. He was obsessed with image, polished shoes, perfect posture, curated laughter. To be seen as anything less than flawless was, in his mind, a failure. Humility was foreign, generosity an inconvenience, kindness a weakness. While she carried wisdom carved from pain, he carried arrogance puffed up by privilege. He was allergic to humility, recoiling at even the suggestion that his life was built on anything but merit. To him, servants were shadows, necessary but insignificant, present but disposable. And so, when he saw her arms around his father, comforting a man broken by grief, his outrage wasn't only about control, it was about fear. Because in her quiet strength she represented everything he had spent his life denying, that dignity could not be bought, that humanity could not be polished away, and that the world did not bend only to those who wore crowns of money. But he didn't see it yet. All he saw was a maid daring to exist in a space he had reserved for those like him. He saw an intruder where, in truth, stood the keeper of something far more valuable than his empire. Truth. The narrator's voice pressed closer, heavy with foreshadowing. He thought she was just a servant. But the truth she carried could shatter his throne of arrogance. The billionaire's voice cut through the grand hall like a lash of a whip. His father's tears still clung to the black maid's shoulder, but he didn't care. Fury demanded a target, and in his mind there was no easier one than the woman who had dared step into a role he believed sacred. His finger jabbed toward her sharp as a knife. "Look at her," he sneered, the words laced with venom. "A parasite feeding off my family's scraps. Tell me, Maid, do you think clinging to men above you makes you part of us?" The hall froze. Investors in crisp tuxedos shifted in their chairs. The wives of politicians raised brows, lips tightening with discomfort. Laughter fluttered faintly, brittle and forced, because when a man of his wealth demanded amusement, people complied. A few leaned forward with their phones half hidden, recording what they sensed might become valuable later. The maid did not flinch. Her dark hands, weathered by years of scrubbing and polishing, hung at her sides. She stood still, back straight, chin lifted just enough to show she heard but would not cower. Her silence was not submission. It was something heavier, a stillness that seemed to absorb the cruelty hurled at her. Her quiet unnerved him. "Do you hear me?" He barked, striding closer so the shine of his imported shoes gleamed beneath the chandelier. "I said you're nothing. Always nothing. A servant polishing silver she could never afford. A shadow living only on the light we cast," the crowd murmured. Some chuckled nervously, unwilling to anger their host. Others pressed their lips tight, shame blooming in their eyes though fear stitched their mouths closed. The man's empire fed many of them. Defiance was unthinkable. Still she said nothing. That silence grew heavier by the second. Guests began to feel it in their chests, a weight pressing down more than his arrogance. The billionaire's anger sharpened. He leaned even closer, his words quieter but cutting through the air like glass. "This is the danger of pity. Show these people kindness and they mistake it for belonging." He swung his arm dramatically toward her, inviting the audience in on his humiliation. "Do you see it? The maid, pretending she has a place among us." Thin laughter echoed. A man at the bar forced a guffaw, though it cracked halfway out. Another guest raised his champagne glass but quickly set it down, unable to toast cruelty. The maid's gaze remained steady, fixed on him but not trapped by him. For a moment, those watching swore she wasn't staring at him at all but at something behind him, something larger, something inevitable. And that scared him. He doubled down. "Without us you'd vanish. You'd have no roof, no bread, no name. Without my family, you're dust." He spat the last word like poison as though it would dissolve her. The crowd shifted uneasily. A woman leaned to her husband and whispered, Why isn't she reacting? She's waiting, came the quiet reply. The billionaire raised his voice, feeding on the murmurs. I will not have my father comforted by hands that should be scrubbing floors. I will not have our bloodline tainted by her touch. My father may be blinded by age, but I see clearly. She doesn't belong in this room, in this house, in this world. The cruelty landed like blows, yet still the maid stood calm. A faint, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. Not arrogance, not defiance, but certainty. It was the kind of smile that said, I know something you don't. The whisper of unease spread faster now. Guests leaned closer to one another, their conversations quiet but their eyes fixed on her stillness. Phones angled higher. People sensed that something far larger than insult and silence was unfolding. She should defend herself, a young investor muttered. No, an older guest replied softly. She carries something else. You can see it. She's holding something. The billionaire scoffed. Look at this. She can't even speak. What can she say? That she's our equal. That she deserves a seat at this table? He let out a cruel laugh, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. I'd rather seat the dog than the maid. For the first time, the faintest sound slipped from the crowd. Not laughter, but a gasp, a ripple of discomfort. His words had gone further than many expected. Yet he basked in it, mistaking fear for respect. The maid inhaled slowly, a steady breath filling her chest. Then she exhaled, her shoulders lowering just slightly, her gaze unbroken. The silence stretched so long it became unbearable. People began to realize the billionaire's shouting sounded weaker against it, like a storm raging against a mountain that would not move. A man at the back of the hall leaned toward his companion, his voice a murmur but clear enough to carry to nearby ears. Careful. Sometimes the quiet ones carry the loudest truths. The words slipped through the room like smoke. More eyes turned toward the maid now, less with pity and more with curiosity, anticipation even. The billionaire caught the shift and his smirk wavered. His voice rose louder, desperate to reassert control. You think your silence makes you strong? No. It proves what I've said all along, that you have no place here. Speak if you dare. Show them all what you are. But she did not speak, and in that silence something larger than defiance was forming. People began to see it, the steadiness in her posture, the unshakable patience in her eyes. They recognized what he could not. She wasn't refusing to answer out of fear. She was refusing because she didn't need to, because the truth she carried was already in the room, waiting. The billionaire laughed again, but it came out hollow, almost shaky. For the first time, he looked small against her stillness, like a man shouting into a canyon that refused to echo back. The crowd had split. Some still chuckled nervously, clinging to his power like lifeboats. But others were leaning forward, captivated by the weight of her silence, whispering to one another with a strange mix of dread and awe. They didn't know what was coming, but they all felt it, and though the billionaire thought he was writing the script, everyone else was beginning to realize they were only in the prologue. The billionaire's voice rose higher, desperation leaking through arrogance. His hands cut the air as if his gestures could carve away her dignity. He circled her like a predator circling prey, but the stillness in her eyes unsettled him. Every insult he'd hurled had failed to crack her composure. He was running out of weapons, and the room knew it. Finally, he slammed his fist against the banquet table, crystal glasses rattling. Enough of this charade, he thundered. You will never be more than a servant. You belong beneath us, beneath me, and no silence of yours will ever change that. The room quivered. Some guests flinched at the force of his fury. Others, phones raised, leaned in closer. The heat of the moment was undeniable. He thought he'd delivered his final blow, that her humiliation was sealed. But in truth, he had only thrown open the door. For the first time, the maid lifted her chin and parted her lips. Her voice, steady and resonant, sliced through the air. Is that what you believe? She asked softly. That I am nothing but a servant? Then let me tell you what your arrogance has blinded you to. The room froze. Her words rang like a bell, and silence fell as thick as velvet. Even the billionaire, caught off guard by the sudden sound of her voice, stepped back involuntarily. She began, her tone deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of decades unsaid. The man you mock me for comforting, the father whose tears stained my shoulder tonight, has known my presence longer than you've been alive. When your empire kept him locked in cages of expectation, when your own mother turned her back, I was the one who listened. When he stumbled under the weight of wealth, I was the one who steadied him. You call me a parasite? No, child. I was his anchor. Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras zoomed in. The billionaire's smirk faltered, replaced by something resembling fear. She continued, her voice rising with the rhythm of truth long suppressed. For years I was treated as invisible, but your father saw me. He confided in me, not as a maid, but as a human being. When the world demanded he wear armor, I was the only one who allowed him to lay it down. And when grief consumed him, when betrayal burned deeper than business loss, it was my arms that carried him through the night. The crowd shifted uneasily. Whispers shot through the audience like sparks racing across dry grass. What is she saying? One woman hissed. Is it true? Murmured another. The billionaire tried to regain ground, his voice sharp with disbelief. Lies? You're nothing but a desperate woman clinging to scraps. Do not insult my father with your fantasies. But her eyes, calm and resolute, cut through him. From within the folds of her simple dress, she drew out an old, creased envelope. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she held it high. This, she said, is his handwriting. A letter written when he had no one else to confide in. Words of gratitude, of secrets buried, of pain only I was trusted to carry. Would you call your father a liar? The room gasped as she carefully unfolded the paper. The billionaire's face drained of color, his jaw clenched tight. Guests craned their necks as her voice read aloud. To the only soul who has seen me weep, you are more family to me than the blood that mocks me. In you I find truth. In you I find peace. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Some clutched their pearls, others covered their mouths. Every phone in the room recorded, beams of light blinking like judgment. The billionaire staggered, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. He reached forward as though to snatch the letter, but she stepped back, her voice steady. No, this truth is no longer yours to bury. The world will know it, because dignity cannot be silenced. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some applauded quietly, unwilling to contain the rising tide of admiration for her courage. Others shook their heads, pitying the billionaire who now stood stripped bare in front of his empire. Desperate, he spat, "Even if this is true, it changes nothing. You're still just the help. You'll never sit at our table. You'll never—" Her gaze cut him down like a blade. "Respect isn't inherited," she said firmly. "It's earned. And tonight, you have shown the world that your wealth buys you nothing but shame." The applause thundered louder now, rising like a storm. The guests who had once laughed at her humiliation now rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, calling her name. Phones angled higher, broadcasting her words live. Within minutes, the internet would echo with her truth. The billionaire stood pale, beads of sweat gathering at his temples. His words had been turned against him. His mockery flipped into his own ruin. She pressed forward, her voice gaining strength with every breath. "You wanted to parade me as weak. Instead, I have shown them your cowardice. You mocked my silence. But my silence was not emptiness, it was patience. And tonight, that patience roars." The audience roared with her, clapping, shouting, flooding the hall with approval. The billionaire sank back into his chair, powerless. Then came the final blow. She turned to the cameras, her face calm but fierce, her voice carrying like a verdict. "Let the world see, humility outlives arrogance. Love outlasts cruelty. And no throne built on lies will stand forever." Phones flashed. Guests cheered. And as the billionaire bowed his head, pale and trembling, the truth she carried eclipsed every ounce of his wealth. In one night, she had checkmated his empire, not with power, not with riches, but with dignity. The silence that followed her words was not weakness, it was judgment. The billionaire stood pale, his shoulders sagging, the letter still trembling in her hand like a weapon sharper than steel. Around him, the glittering circle of elites began to shift uneasily. Board members exchanged nervous glances. Investors who had once bragged of their loyalty to him pulled out their phones, furiously typing messages, distancing themselves before the tide swept them under. A man who had built his empire on fear and performance now looked small, stripped of all armor. His credibility, once unshakable, had collapsed in a single night. The whispers grew into murmurs, then into open conversations. "How could we have followed him?" a woman asked aloud. "If this is the truth, his arrogance blinded us all," another replied. The billionaire's name, once spoken with awe, now carried only pity and disdain. And then the applause came. Not polite, not hesitant, but thunderous. It wasn't for him. It was for her. She stood firm, shoulders squared, every inch of her presence commanding respect. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had simply told the truth, and in doing so, she had changed the balance of power. Strangers reached for her hands, thanking her, calling her brave. Some wept openly, moved by the quiet dignity of a woman who had endured cruelty and turned it into revelation. The cameras, still rolling, captured every second. By the time she stepped out of that hall, the footage was already traveling across continents, headlines forming in real time. Billionaire shamed by Maid's truth. Arrogance meets its reckoning. His humiliation was no longer private, it was immortalized. Later that night, in the quiet of her small home, she dialed her mother's number. Her voice trembled when she heard the familiar tone on the other end. "Mama," she whispered, "I didn't just stand there tonight. I spoke." Her mother's reply carried the weight of generations. "Child, you didn't just survive their cruelty. You made them listen. You made the world listen." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow but of release. Years of silence, of swallowing pride, of bowing her head when mocked, had finally broken open into vindication. She had carried her grandmother's lesson all her life. Dignity doesn't shout, it waits, then it roars. Tonight, it had roared loud enough to shake an empire. Meanwhile, the billionaire faced a reckoning far greater than a single lost argument. The media swarmed, cameras flashing as he left the hall. Journalists shouted questions he couldn't answer. His PR team scrambled, issuing statements that rang hollow. Investors pulled funding, partners cut ties, and by morning, stocks tied to his empire began to fall. He was no longer the man who commanded respect in boardrooms. He was the man whose arrogance had been exposed by a maid. His cruelty, once applauded as toughness, was now branded as weakness. And she was no longer invisible. The world now knew her name. Articles praised her as a voice of resilience, a reminder that truth can come from the quietest corners. Commentators marveled at her composure, calling her the woman who stood taller than a billionaire. In that reversal lay the real power. The story no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her. By the end of the week, her face was on magazine covers, her words quoted in speeches. She had not sought fame, but dignity has a way of finding the light. She became a symbol for workers everywhere, for the overlooked, for those who carried truth in silence until the world finally gave them a stage. The billionaire's name still appeared in headlines, but not as a mogul. He was the cautionary tale, the emblem of arrogance destroyed by humility. Where once he had been admired, now he was mocked. His empire had not fallen yet, but its foundations were cracked beyond repair. The maid had spoken, and the world had listened. The morning after, the world was different. Not because the billionaire had lost his composure, but because a maid, someone society had overlooked and dismissed, had shown the world what dignity looked like when it roared. Her name, once confined to whispered instructions in a mansion, now appeared on headlines across nations. People who had never known her existence now spoke of her as if she had always been a beacon. Journalists sought interviews, activists reached out, and strangers flooded her with messages of gratitude. She did not bask in fame. Instead, she asked herself what she could do with the voice she now carried. Within months, she launched a foundation dedicated to domestic workers' rights, education, and dignity. What began as a modest initiative quickly gained global traction. Donations poured in, not just from ordinary people inspired by her courage, but from philanthropists, leaders, and organizations who recognized the moment as more than a scandal. It was a turning point. She organized workshops to teach workers about their rights, created scholarship funds for their children, and pushed for policies that protected them from humiliation and abuse. For the first time, countless maids, cleaners, and caretakers felt seen. Meanwhile, the billionaire's fall was as swift as it was humiliating. He tried to repair his image with public statements, but they rang hollow against the undeniable truth that the world had witnessed. His empire began to fracture. Partners cut ties, sponsors fled, and his name, once synonymous with power and prestige, became shorthand for arrogance undone. His wealth did not vanish overnight, but the respect he had built his empire upon crumbled irreversibly. In business schools and leadership seminars, his story was retold not as an example of success, but as a cautionary tale. A man who had everything yet lost it all by mocking the very hands that steadied his father's shoulders. The ripple effect of her truth reached far beyond one household. Companies, stung by the global outrage, began implementing reforms. Hotels, corporations, and wealthy families rolled out new codes of conduct, zero-tolerance policies for abuse, and initiatives designed to honor workers as human beings, not servants. What once had been whispered grievances found a stage, and the stage was too bright to ignore. She did not fight for these reforms alone. Her foundation became a hub, a gathering place for voices too long silenced. She stood beside them, reminding the world again and again, respect isn't charity. It's the bare minimum. The internet immortalized her legacy. Clips of the confrontation amassed millions of views. Hashtags surged, made of truth, respect over riches, when dignity roars. From New York to Nairobi, from Paris to Manila, her story was retold in schools, churches, and community centers. Memes, murals, and speeches carried her words, each retelling reshaping her from a solitary maid into a universal symbol of justice. And yet, through it all, she remained humble. She continued to work, not out of obligation, but as a reminder that dignity had never been beneath her station. It had always been her crown. What changed was that the world finally saw it. The billionaire faded into obscurity, his arrogance remembered only in the context of its undoing. But she rose, not as a maid, not as a worker, but as a voice, one that reminded millions that dignity can come from the quietest, most unexpected places. Her legacy was not just the downfall of one man. It was the rise of a movement. They mocked her as just a maid, forgetting truth doesn't wear uniforms of wealth. In one moment their empire cracked, and her dignity stood higher than any fortune. The billionaire believed his power rested in money, in reputation, in silencing those he thought beneath him. But his arrogance blinded him to the quiet strength that had stood beside his father for years, the strength of compassion, the courage of loyalty, the roar of truth long silenced. Her voice did not tremble. Her presence did not bow. And when she finally spoke, the world stopped to listen. That night was not simply the fall of one arrogant man. It was the rise of millions who had been unseen, unheard, and unvalued. She carried their dignity in her words, and with it, she shattered the illusion that power belongs only to the wealthy. True power, secrecy, honesty. True wealth, humility. True downfall, arrogance unmasked. If you believe dignity doesn't need riches to roar, share this story. Let the world see. Arrogance may shine, but truth will always outlast it.